Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The theme this year has been the study of Arab Spring and the way it generates at different levels the response of the people and their leaders. The spring began with much expectation and enormous capacity to bring about reform and change in the Muslim world. But that reform is not possible without the good leadership that can be provided by the Muslim intellectuals working in those countries and interacting with the traditional leaders who are looking for solutions to the problems they have not been able to address as the modern time demands them. Reform movement has been going on for the last 2 centuries. In different ways, we have seen in the Muslim world an upheaval, sometimes political turmoil, sometimes crisis, revolutions. And what we did not expect to happen was something in the Arab world which will stir the population to stand for their rights and understand what it means to be the citizens of that country now. Living under different autocratic systems, we had abandoned the way we think about our own good, because that was done by the politicians. They thought what we needed, and they made those decisions. The challenge today then is for the reformers to look again at the resources that are available. It is not only rereading the Quran and rereading the Sunnah, but also trying to understand the legal and ethical foundations of reform in the Muslim world. إن الله لا يغير ما بقوم حتى يغيروا ما بأنفسهم. The change has to come from within. Today the politics is dominating Islamic values. We still have not come to the stage whereby Islamic values will begin to guide ethically the politics. And that politics, until it becomes guided by those norms and values that are internationally recognized, to create a global citizen, will be lagging behind. It is my contention that Islamic sources have not been reread, are not being reread for inspiration. Rather, there has been a very superficial retrieval of the resources, which are more used to put down the opposition, to cut down people who don't agree with the majority. And this has created a bigger challenge for the reformers in the Muslim world today. The Arab Spring is a challenge to think about reformation from within when the dialogue has not even begun. Muslim peoples are not talking to one another. The complaint was there in the last century, which has continued even now. The cyberspace is controlled by hostilities, is controlled by animosities rather than conversations. There are those who want to damage at any cost the unity that is possible among Muslims, and they are using cyberspace for that. The time has come for the reform leaders not only to think about retrieving the resources in the right ways, but to moralize the entire conversation about coexistence in the world. I recently attended Muscat conference on the jurisprudence of coexistence, fiqh al-ma'ayish. And yet, there was hardly a single paper dealing with Shia-Sunni relationship, which is at the heart of animosity at the moment. Every day you wake up and every day you hear Muslims killing fellow Muslims. Some are regarded as wajibul qatl, like the Shia, because they're not even Muslims. We have not even discussed those issues because they are too bitter for us to discuss. This is the challenge for the reformers. Will they be able to face with the situation they are faced with today in the community itself? John Wall, whose work I have known for a long time, we have been together working on fundamentalism at one point. And now we are together perhaps working on what a reformation can do. Yes, I think we are at the crossroads of paradigm shift. And it's not only the conception of leadership that has changed, but also the role of traditional leaders who provide the credibility to the politicians has also changed. This was an observation made by H.A.R. Gibb many, many years ago, that without the participation of the ulama, we will not see the reform movement taking roots in the Muslim societies. I think what we are discovering is that the idea of democracy and the idea of Islam, whether it is compatible with it or not, is still a major issue that surfaces every now and then when the new political authority is being challenged at the level of the civil associations. Because the problem is that without the thoroughgoing rereading of the text that would provide justification for the new type of understanding, and without that credibility, without that authenticity, we'll always have a problem in getting the reforms channelized through the right sources to become part of the understanding of the population themselves. People are not ignorant. They are thinking and they are objecting to the way the politicians are using Islam, the way they are somehow retrieving Islam according to the social and political needs of the society, so to speak. The political theology, in other words, is still looking for anchors in the tradition. Because without the anchors in the tradition, you will have a problem of authenticity. Even Muslim Brotherhood, however popular they might be, they still have to search for authentic way of connecting with the political theological doctrines, what they want to see as democratization of the Egyptian society. Because the greatest challenge that faces Muslim Brotherhood is, what kind of citizenship are we looking at? Because if we are going to look into the Islamic sources, if we are going to talk about the Sharia, if we are going to talk about Islamic values, then we will have a problem of facing the reality test. Does Islam have the vocabulary that is compatible to the modern political language? And without that language, how exactly are we going to convince the public that even when we are somehow, tolerating religious differences, we are within the boundaries of what we believe to be our eternal faith? Because that's the whole question. If you're going to compromise your faith, and if you're going to compromise the very important doctrines that inform you about your identity, then you have a problem of justifying the changes that are going to take place. It's going beyond the demonstrations. What exactly can democracy deliver? What can Islamic democracy deliver in the constitution, in the laws of the country? This was the question facing Iraq. And Iraq did not have a large, minority of non-Muslims. There was, of course there were. But there were what we call interfaith problems to sort out before they could even create what we call the national culture of Iraq. And there we have this problem of how the text could come to help the Constitutional Commission to provide a system that would be a modern system of constitution and which would provide democracy without compromising Islamic value system. After all, the majority of the people are Muslims. But the test for democracy is preservation and protection of the right of the minorities. That's where the test lies. And whether the Muslim Brotherhood government is able to do that or not is a big textual question. And it is a political, theological question where the thinkers have to come together. In the previous generation, we had the secularists who were imposing the paradigm from outside. It was a secular paradigm that was being imposed in the Muslim world. And it was easy to do because the authority was in their hands. They were coming educated back to their countries and telling the people, we are backward because of Islam. Or we have to change Islam, we have to become secular. And that fight was there going on. Even in Arab nationalism, whether it was Arab socialism, everywhere we had this struggle going on. Now for the first time, Muslims are saying that we can also create a civil society. We can also create a democratic society. How exactly are we going to do it? We should not underestimate the role women are playing in forcing men to think carefully of the resources that are available. Now, our usage of the terms are tricky. We are still talking about clerical, theocratic rule in Iran. All wrong paradigms, I must say, because those paradigms are completely false. There's no priesthood, there's no sacraments, there's no church, nothing that proves that Hassan Rouhani is a cleric. That's our term. That's not their term. And that's why I think we need to explore the terminology that is evolving in the political language of the Middle East today. What exactly are the thinkers doing? And how exactly are they going to challenge the secular, saying that our model also works? As much as you promised us that your model works, it did not work, we can show you that our model works. Again, here the role of the ulama is extremely important. Remember, what role is Qaradawi playing at the moment in flaring up Shia-Sunni problems, by the way? In telling the people how this Shia are kafir, who should be cut off, you know. This is Qaradawi's role. And this is a challenge to democracy. If there are 2 million Shia in Egypt itself, then we have a problem in our hands. How are we going to protect their rights? That's the democracy we are talking about. And that's the Islam that is being challenged. What kind of Islam, what kind of new vocabulary is going to come in the region to really set off a new form of reform that is needed? A reform that speaks realistically to the political doctrines that are prevalent in the society. This is where maqasid. When we talk about maqasid in the jurisprudence, we are talking about moral values. These are universal values. Can religion create a universal language? Can it provide a universal idiom for democracy to thrive under the name of Islam? If it can, then we will see different results. If it can't, then we'll see totally different results of the transformation. Thank you. I think we are having very, very interesting questions. And there needs to be...
only the first round.
Yes,
Yeah.
And this is just the beginning, so to
Yeah.
speak, yeah. And I think what is important to keep in mind is that there is a need for conceptual clarity, which is not to be found also in the Muslim world. That is, I do submit that people do use the word Sharia very loosely and do not make, use of the proper words that are required. Fiqh is another matter. Sharia is a set of values that come out of the Quran, and they are immutable values, and therefore they don't change. But their application might vary from place to place. This is where jurisprudence comes. And juridical exercise and juridical tradition is certainly human tradition. And there was this question whether this Sharia can ever be implemented, in the state. Not until the Sharia really begins, not until the scholars of the Islamic religious law begin to make distinctions between human-God relationship and human-human relationship, the way our classical scholars did. When they spoke about ibadat, they kept it very much stable and unchangeable and immutable. But when they came to mu'amalat, we found that every madhab had its own mu'amala, every madhab had its own fatwa, and they did give a sense in which we do find that human beings, human agents, human jurists are reading the sources and interpreting them for the community as the time comes. I don't think we have done that, and therefore even to extract the concept of citizenship from the Sharia has been one of the biggest challenges. Because if you are mixing Sharia with the fiqh, then you have no way of, regarding, because you cannot regard fiqh as normative. Juridical process is not normative. The sources we are using have normativity within them. Those are the values from which we derive the laws. So there are many issues that we can really bring them up, and I don't think Nasr Abu Zaid was really in a position to give the fatwa. I think his main function was to give a sense that these Islamic sources have different readings. We must engage them hermeneutically, that they should be read by different times with different people, and it requires scholarship. Therefore, he's providing, for example, qira'at al-mu'tazila. This is how the rationalists read it. This is how the traditional. In other words, we really do not have that kind of authority invested. This wilaya that we are talking about is, I said about authority. We need authority.
Authority, not power.
Yes, and this is authority. Wilaya is potentially power, but it is exactly the authority to really exact obedience. Not that it is there to say, obey me, but it has the ability to do so if all other factors come into play. So really we are talking about a kind of guardianship and a kind of, overseeing role that is given to the scholars, or sometimes to the sultan, sometimes to the appointees of the sultan. And this is important to keep in mind, that without wilaya we can't even think about the implementation of the law. So we do have that. But this is simply exacting the obedience rather than implementing the obedience of the law. And I think that's the distinction. In other words, let me be very clear here in my last comment here, that we are dealing with very fluid conceptual discussions today about Sharia, about fiqh, and especially in the academia at the moment, social scientists are mixing up everything. And we really have a problem of exactly saying that, no, that's not the way we understand this, or that's not the way we would interpret this. And I think this is the time even Muslim scholars themselves are faced with the same kind of misappropriation of the concepts and the way they function in the actual life of application. So we have values, we have norms that are immutable, but their application is very human. I'm an intruder in this whole debate that is going on, because I'm not into the very, what we call, practice of politics. I'm rather searching for the thought behind politics, and I'm searching for paradigms that are shifting and that tell us something about the dynamics of the Islamic thought. What I'm searching for is the language of classical Islam, especially the fiqh al-siyasi, that political jurisprudence, is being recast into the new idiom in a way in which we find that the new idiom is more consonant with the principles of governance today. In other words, this is my thinking, and I'm presenting here a thesis that the political language of Islam is very much informed by socio-political conditions in which thinkers operate by looking at the tradition they've inherited and with the challenges they are faced with. Now, we don't have to go into the whole debate of where this idea is coming from, but let me say this from the outset, that the Sharia itself, although there are no chapters of Kitab al-Imara, there are no chapters on the governance or Kitab al-Hakimiyya in the fiqh discussions, but there was an undercurrent in the fiqh text, and that was to say that we are watching over the rulers and we want them to be accountable to the public for what they do. Now, how they would do it and what kind of system should they follow was never made clear, because it was simply left out to say that we just have a preamble for you. The preamble of a constitution is al-amr bil-ma'ruf wa nahy anil munkar. This is the preamble. We are looking at what we call what makes a government a legitimate government. A legitimate government is the one which has the welfare of the people at heart. And that welfare of the people is very much part of the scales of justice that are included in the Sharia itself. Sharia then is, the applied law of the Sharia is then providing us with the scales of justice which need to be discovered by people in each generation for them to implement them. This is the question that has come out at this time. And I'm talking about a very important email that I received from the young people in Egypt, inviting me to come and discuss my book, Islamic Roots of Democratic Pluralism. Democratic pluralism. And this was something out of the blue. I received this email and they said, we want you to come, and then can we talk to you? So I give the phone number and they're talking to me. In other words, what they find interesting is, in Islamic thought, is that Islamic thought is looking for authoritative language that can speak to the modernist as much as to the classicist. This is the struggle, by the way. The struggle is that how do I make myself clear? If I was challenged by the ulama, where are you coming from? Do you know these things? Do you know, have you read this? Have you read this? This is how they talk to you, by the way. The ulama, they do ask you very plain, very clearly, did you read this? Have you read this? Now, if you say you haven't read it, you have lost the ground, by the way. You already lost your battle. So therefore, this is what is very interesting, that the younger generation of the Muslim Brotherhood is, although they avoided traditional leadership in their own development, now they want to have the traditional leadership on their side in such a way that they would justify the movement that is going towards clearly a modern nation state. So here we have a heritage, and it's not only the question of Sunni Islam. I think generally, whether Shia Islam or Sunni Islam, they are caught up in what we call, what the classical tradition lays down. And how do we get the classical tradition to speak to the modern challenges? Can it respond to the modern challenges without compromising its phenomenal integrity, phenomenological integrity? That integrity has to be preserved. In other words, if I'm talking about the Sharia state or siyasat al-Shar'iyya, if I'm talking about the politics in accordance with the principles of the Sharia, am I speaking the language that is honest enough to get the ulama on my side of the conversation and to speak to the modernists and to get them to understand that this is what I mean by siyasat al-Sharia? In other words, Hakimiyya takes a central stage, but in a very different way. I'm talking about my field work. I haven't read many books on politics, but I do a lot of interviews. In my interviews, my interest is to see that we have had a history of autocratic rulership. Modern political science is telling us that voting or bringing to power through ballot is something that is instrumental to the modern nation state. It needs it. This is the only way we can find out if people are politically participating. Political participation then is reduced to casting of the votes. And we have seen that the casting of the votes have not created the hakimiyya that is just. There is no justice in the hakimiyya. Even when people cast the vote, they are still running against the authority that is trying to control them, that is trying to suffocate their freedoms. So here is the question that comes up. Classical tradition is telling us that you have to obey ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul ulil amri minkum. Ulil amri minkum are these political leaders. You have to obey them. It's required by the law. And therefore you are not going to go against them. Opposition to them is not tolerated. Imam Ghazali would come as far as quoting Imam Ali, saying that Imam Ali did not want to see chaos in the society. Therefore he said that you can also obey tyrannical rulers, because orderliness is far more important than having a ruler who is satisfactory to everyone. In other words, there was justice to be sacrificed. Now, if Ghazali is right about it, that means he says that having one night of chaos is worse than having, in other words, that chaos should not be tolerated. You would rather obey. That evil, you are choosing between two evils. The evil of the bad government is acceptable than the evil of creating chaos in the society. And yet there is, you look at the ahkam al-bughat in fiqh, it's very interesting that there is no conception of irregular warfare in Islam. Baghi is not irregular warfare. It is oppositional warfare. You are opposed to the government that you think is unjust. Therefore, there are certain conditions that must be met before you declare the Baghi, before you declare really opposition, muqawama, so to speak. Shawka is one of them. You need the leadership, you need the niyyah of the people that are with you, and you then approach the ruler and tell the ruler that you are not doing your job very well. If you don't change, we will challenge you, we'll overthrow you. And the responsibility of all the loss in the society will be on your head. This is what Ahkam al-Bughat would say. So when you look at Ahkam al-Bughat, it is actually talking about political participation of the people. It's not saying that the people should silently submit to the wrong governments, to tyrannical governments. It's actually encouraging them to say that, no, you should be vigilant. You should look around. If they are not doing their job well, you have a right to challenge them. But how do I challenge them if they are going to throw me in the prison? So you really have a double catch here, that either, you keep quiet and you don't. So we have taqiyya orientation in the Shia political thought. That you have taqiyya, you do dissimulation, and this is, concealment, which is very prudential. You need to do that. If you don't do that, you will not survive. You wait for the right time to strike, so to speak. This is what taqiyya is teaching. Now, we don't have that thought in the Sunni Islam. It doesn't say you can practice taqiyya, but what it says is very clear that, well, you wait for the right time to strike. If you don't see it this time, you will do it next time. In other words, there is already muqawama as part of the political participation justified in the classical literature, which we think is very authoritarian. Most of the Orientalist literature would tell you that Islamic governments were despotic. They were, it was a, Orientalist kind of dictatorship, and there was nowhere for the people to change anything. Quite to the contrary. Khalid Abul Fazl's contribution is very important to keep in mind, that Khalid tells us that actually in Islamic Sharia, you already have a provision of accountability. A ruler must be weighed in terms of what he performs and how he performs. The Sharia is not silent about it. What is happening today is that political participation is taking different forms. You have now political participation under the very autocratic governments. You hear about the Human Rights Watch, Saudi Human Rights Watch. These are the people who are watching over Saudi government's performance in human rights. Where do they participate politically? Where do they show their opposition? In other words, what we are looking for is a total shift of paradigm. And our paradigms created by political scientists are not responsive to the actual fieldwork that we're doing. The fieldwork demands that we create a new terminology to understand what does the leadership mean. How is the leadership evaluated? What kind of resistance is built into the system? We are talking about we always dismiss saying that, oh, this is tribalism, or, this is dictatorship. But no, there is within that system, the people did have space to express their opposition. They did not keep quiet all the time. And the mechanism was provided by fiqh, by jurisprudence. Not only maqasid today are, in my opinion, in my humble opinion, maqasid are the only categories that apply across different religious groups. And this is what the nation state needs. If you're talking about the protection of life, yes, everybody needs it. If you're talking about the protection of the property, everybody needs it. You can, in other words, the universal language that we are searching for is available in maqasid. Maqasid is a moral language. And moral language does not recognize the legal boundaries that are part of the legal systems. So if you're talking about Sharia, then you are talking about legal boundaries that are applicable only to the people within the community. But when you go to maqasid, it goes beyond the Sharia. You're talking about daruriyat. You're talking about tahsiniyat. You're talking about these categories that are general enough to apply to all human beings as the member society as the members of the human society. Today the political thought is moving, and this is my observation. Some of the articles are coming out, both in Iran, from Iran and other places. There's a lot of rethinking going on. For the first time, I find there is serious search for a new epistemology among Muslim thinkers. And that is, by the way, this is where, yes, and you see, what we are looking at is there is already dissatisfaction with the responses that we are receiving from traditional seminarian education. It's not giving the responses. Al-Azhar is not giving the responses. Najaf is not giving the responses. If you ask Ayatollah Sistani, what does it mean to be moderate, he doesn't know it. Whereas what we are searching for is moderation on the political level. That moderation is not there. Ayatollah Sistani is no Democrat. He's no moderate. He really believes against pluralism. He doesn't hold it. He says, no pluralism. This is bid'ah. This is shirk. This is what he says. What is democracy? And this is my own conversation with Sistani, by the way. And he says, what are you talking about, democracy or pluralism? It doesn't exist. And I said, well, it is. Can't we read the Quran again? He said, no, you can't read the Quran again without our directions. So you have the ulama controlling the language of the Quran. How the Quran is to be negotiated will be negotiated by a certain class of the scholastic community. And that scholastic community is now being forced for the first time. And this is Muscat, by the way. We heard in Muscat papers. We would have never heard it them 10 years ago. Coexistence, out of question. Pluralism, out of question. They didn't mention democracy, by the way. I did not hear democracy. But I did hear about the hukuk al-nas, the human rights. They were talking about these issues for the first time. Ali Al-Goma, who was there, and he was being interviewed, and he said, yes, there's a problem. In our own epistemology, there's a problem in our ma'rifah. In other words, we need to come to terms with the new epistemology that must be applied not only to the study of the Quran, not only to the study of the nuances of the Sunnah when it comes to the political situation with which we are confronted today in the modern nation state. Because for the Sharia, there was an empire. There was a sultan, there was a khalifa. Now for the Sharia, there will be president, there will be prime minister, there will be parliament. Will they be able to respond this from internally by looking at the terminology and reinterpreting it, or will it come from the West as it has always come? This is where the political thought is at the moment, in a very critical crossroads. How exactly are they going to pass through it? If they can respond to it, and I mentioned very clearly, there is a demand for radical democracy. not liberal democracy in the Middle East, in the third world countries. And that means there is a demand for justice. People want to see justice. People want to see bread on their tables. They are not concerned with the freedoms which does not guarantee anything on their table, which doesn't give them the roof on their head. Radical democracy is being represented now gradually, not with the terminology, by the ulama who are actively engaged. Some of the younger generations are actively engaged in creating the new terminology that the political scientists will be surprised to find in the field. When they go in the field, they will be surprised to see what they find, whether it is in Iran, Iraq, or anywhere else. Thank you very much.